Welcome for all of you to have joined the cafe today. When Mary, who I think is also on the call and works with Action Synergy, and myself, who is working for Walk, Listen, Create, and together we are part of a consortium called Walking Arts and Local Communities, which is a pan-European collaboration between 6 organizations in 5 countries. Walk stands for Walking Arts and Local Communities. When Mary and I decided that it would be an interesting idea to bring artists and activists together and discuss the politics of walking in a context of grief, solidarity, and resistance, we considered a number of recent examples of where marches and demonstrations were instrumental in conveying discontent and frustration. Now, at the time, we were thinking of recent events in Greece, amongst others, Greece, Serbia, India, Kenya, the US, and of course, Palestine. Now, perhaps what we did was we primed the well, as you could say, when we started looking for speakers in our initial announcement, including an image of a pro-Palestine demonstration. And so perhaps as a consequence of this, we ended up with 4 excellent speakers who all are in one way or the other connected to Palestine. I'm going to be speaking today with the following 4 people. This is Nohat El-Haj, who is an independent researcher based in Lebanon, whose work bridges art, politics, and social change. We also have Marta Morena Munoz, who just recently was part of the Global March to Gaza and is the creator of 2020 The Walk, which brought together walking and climate activism. We also have Robert, and excuse me if I do this wrong, Yerachmiel Schneiderman, who is a multidisciplinary artist whose projects mobilize urban geographies to hold memories of violence, displacement, and social rupture. And we have Tom Jeffries, who is a writer and editor who recently co-organized the Edinburgh Walk for Gaza. Now, in a minute, I'll prompt our 4 speakers with a question which allows them to give a bit of context to briefly introduce themselves, after which we'll have a Q&A between myself and the speakers. Please keep yourself muted if you're not speaking, but you're all welcome to, at any time, raise your virtual hand if you have a question, and I will try to call on you if I notice your virtual hand, which I should. You can also put questions in the chat. Someone. Jane, maybe. You can also put your questions in the chat, though be advised that I won't always be able to get to them because I might just miss them. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'm turning my head because this is where YouTube is for me. If you're watching on YouTube, you're also welcome to pose your questions on YouTube, but there also I cannot guarantee that I'll get to your question in time during the call. Now, for the talks that we'll have today, I will try to steer our discussion more towards the politics of walking and less so to the events in Palestine, as I primarily like to talk about walking as a political driver, not about the atrocities in Gaza and elsewhere in Palestine. Having said that, I want to be very clear that Israel is an apartheid state of settler colonists. I think it's important to bring this out, particularly with the 4 speakers that we have, which structurally has committed crimes against humanity since 1948 and at a shocking rate over the last 2 years. Aided by the hypocrites in Europe and North America, the current destruction of Palestine and Palestinians is by far the worst conflict of our times, at least in my opinion, and is set to define our future for decades to come. Not in terms of the life lost. For example, if we look at the conflict in Ukraine, there are reports that over 2 million Russians and Ukrainians have lost their lives. It's incredible. But it is the worst conflict of our times in terms of the broader implications. Israel, with the constant help of the US and Europe, is hollowing out the fragile concept of the rule-based international order in the service of blatant racism and exploitation, while the economic elite profit to the tunes of billions of dollars, attempting to further split the world between those who have and those who have not. In this age of late-stage capitalism, where the periphery no longer suffices as the basis for exploitation-based economic growth, the periphery has shifted to the center, and the conflict in Palestine is therefore a driver for creating destitute classes in the global south and in the heart of empire. Therefore, the only way in which we stand a chance to survive, let alone thrive, is not if we manage to support the freedom of Palestine, but if we realize that Palestine is in a position to be able to free the world. That's the inversion. Having said that, I reiterate that I would like our discussion more to focus on the politics of walking, but note that if you get too vocal in opposition to what I just said, I might direct you to the YouTube stream. Now, having said that, back to the topic of our discussion. And I would like to start with Nohad. Thanks for being here. Oh, wow, let people in at the last minute. Nohad, your work bridges art, politics, and social change across multiple cultures, from Lebanon, South Africa, Scotland, I think, Kuwait. You were just now in Spain, if I remember correctly. How do you navigate the ethical and cultural complexities of inviting diverse communities into participatory processes, especially around grief and human rights narratives? God.
Thank you, Babak. I'm very happy to be here also, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Yeah, as you said, I'm based in Beirut, Lebanon, and I work at the intersection of the development sector, mainly with civil society organizations. And what I do is I facilitate participatory processes, mainly dialogue processes as well, based on writing. And at the intersection also of art and culture, which where more or less my artistic research based on walking is situated. And I also have a Tai Chi practice, which keeps me sane first. But then I use all of these practices or all of these kind of tools to navigate basically the complexities of my locality in a way, or the locality of the world, I guess. So answering your question, and based on what I've been doing so far in those three areas, let's say, I think the first thing is always starting from myself and bringing my intention very explicitly and bringing my positionality very explicitly to the group, or also to the project that I'm working in. So I bring forward, especially when I started, if I want to focus on my walking practice, when I started with walking with artists to answer a question about how can art become, or which form of art is the most impactful in terms of protest, in terms of social change. And I had all of these like very existential questions almost. But then when I started to walk, I received even further questions and even further confrontations. So the first thing was always bringing even my vulnerability, what I need in that moment, and what I needed back in 2020 was to walk in the city, was to understand it, was to deconstruct all the narratives almost as well. And it was how it kind of evolved was around also holding a space. So the walk itself became the space where, you know, there is like the sense of emergence. So maybe few elements are planned, but the main thing is to hold the space for what would emerge. Putting into consideration the fact that we don't know things, there is already always confrontation, especially if I walked in Beirut, a very multi-layered city. There is a lot of history in it. Also, there is a lot of violence somehow.
Is this, is this the piece where you walked in Beirut and broadcasted to France?
To Belgium, exactly. Belgium. That was part of my artistic research. And the idea was also because Beirut is always romanticized or victimized. And this is what I was making, let's say, my piece for, is that I can protest myself walking in the streets, but without victimizing, without dramatizing, and simply just being in that walk. So holding all of these contradictions was part of it. But I think with the years, especially now, for me, the other thing that I did is also walking with literature, for myself, but also with the others, bringing literature into the walks. Because even if I walked in, or other people walked in the same street, the same Beirut that we see, if I read a novel about the civil war, the buildings suddenly started to act differently, to feel differently. And this is also another tool that I made, so I can navigate those ethical questions in a way, or also navigate those complexities, whether cultural or contextual somehow. So this is briefly. I don't know if
Thanks.
it's too brief, but I'll try to. Just cut me if I talk so much.
It is too brief, but I also have to ask questions from the other guests. But I do have some follow-up questions. I might come back to you
Sure.
on that, and I definitely will come back to you. But I've got many more questions too. But thanks. I'm going to move to Marta next. Thanks also for being here. Now, having recently returned, Marta, from the Global March to Gaza, and again working on project All Eyes on Gaza, which I think is going to facilitate a larger flotilla that is going to go to Palestine. And having earlier led the Art and Activism Project 2020, The Walk, together with Extinction, or as part of Extinction Rebellion. How does, for you, walking as embodied climate activism differ when the political context shifts? That is, from environmental causes, before with Extinction Rebellion, to now really a geopolitical crisis. Marta.
Thank you, Babak. Thank you to everyone for putting this event together and to be present today. And regards your question, well, I just came back from, as you said, from the Global March to Gaza, but I was there just as a participant. While 2020 The Walk was an art and activist project, which I led as part of a campaign for the movement I've been active for the last 5 years, Extinction Rebellion. So I think I will speak more later on about 2020 The Walk, but since you are asking about this campaign, the Global March to Gaza, both something have in common is that the polycrisis, the root cause of this disaster we are in, the root cause of the climate emergency, the climate chaos, and the genocide in Palestine are colonialism. So a logic of domination, a logic of consumption, of supremacy, extraction, displacement. It's a logic of destruction of life. So both my personal project and this campaign, I was just a participant, had that in common, because putting our bodies in place of harm and injustice, we understood putting our bodies and placing the bodies in this walk as an act of resistance. Paradoxically, in the Global March to Gaza, we didn't march. There were more than 4,000 participants who traveled to Egypt from more than 80 countries with the aim to reach the Rafah border, to break the siege and open the humanitarian aid and stop the genocide. We were stopped by the Egyptian authorities, so we could not actually march. But paradoxically, that triggered a huge solidarity internationally and strengthened the solidarity for the Palestinian cause. So there were marches all over the world in different cities, different countries, and we increased it. We helped somehow to increase the pressure, the moral pressure and political pressure from our countries who are complicit. And so thousands of marches emerged. And even though we could not march towards Rafah, we helped to spread this new internationalist movement, the global movement to Gaza, which is now part also of a new coalition, part of this global Summit flotilla, which is about to sail dozens of boats towards Gaza to allow a sea corridor for humanitarian aid. We need together to keep this momentum. We all together created. We need to keep the pressure going, and I believe in international solidarity, and this is the way.
Thanks. I'm going to reiterate something that you said earlier, which is something that I also often say and just not realized when I asked you the question. I said, how does activism differ when the political context shifts? But it's very easily arguable that the political context did not shift, because both climate activism or protesting against the exploitation of the climate and the settler colonialist project are very much both symptoms of empire, of colonialism. So arguably, it's exactly the same context. Very well. Very, very well pointed out. Thank you. I'm going to move to Robert. Thanks also for being here, Robert. Your interventions map intergenerational grief within urban geographies, mostly, but not only. How does walking for you serve as a form of living archive? And can you perhaps share an example where architecture or space itself becomes a kind of collaborator in your storytelling?
Thanks for having me here, and thank you, Babak, for the difficult opening question. So I think I guess the maybe where I would begin to answer this, because I think it would be answered different ways depending on the work at hand, right, and the place. And so I think even just that notion signifies something important about what the entire, act of walking might mean in terms of memory and, what you called archiving. And I think it's resonant with some of the things that Nohad was discussing as well. But that I think the concern with walking, or even just the act itself as a kind of artistic, political practice, for me begins with just everyday experience. That it's grounded in everyday experience, but a particular kind of everyday experience that has to do with the way that we pass each other, the way that we pass strangers, the way that we move towards, in a way, places and people. And my first work with walking was in Berlin, and it was these Gaza walks, but it was within the larger framework of a study of the largest intact and active Jewish cemetery in Europe, or in post-war Europe, which is Jüdische Friedhof Weissensee in East Berlin. And I think I could give and the framework of the project, which I think answers the last question or responds to it, is that basically the basis of the project was to every day either walk to and from this cemetery or not. And so in some ways, while I was in residence in Berlin, I was forming a kind of innate relationship to this space that I think had something very powerful to say about the city and the city's history. Of course, its history of genocide. And the reason why I was fixated on the cemetery itself was because it was the only place in Berlin, or place of Jewish memory in Berlin, that was actually created by Jews themselves, purely, and by everyday people, where they were representing themselves. They weren't being represented for by artists or by museums or by the city or the state in these acts of reparation or what have you. And moreover, within that representation was embedded by the genocide itself, because this was a massive cemetery that was supposed to hold the bodies of generations of Jews to come. following the 40s. And while people continue to be buried there, you know, you can tell that they don't have the number of gardeners that they used to have, and it's basically a kind of overgrown forest, and many of the graves are not even legible anymore. And so the genocide itself and the history of Jewish modernity within Berlin and Europe at large is written into that space. And I wanted to form a relationship to the city as a whole through the lens of the cemetery, you know, as a walking body. And after massacres began to unfold in Gaza during the Great March of Return, I felt like I had to turn what I was doing towards the way that the Jewish body was read in space in the present, politically in Berlin. And that's why I began to walk between the cemetery and other locations in the city, with Gaza written in my back in Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin letters, which was informed by practices and the way that the cemetery kind of socially and visually communicates. So it was about kind of dislocating the cemetery, which is walled in, and even in a traditional sense, that it's very important in Jewish tradition for it to be a place that's separate from everyday life, that's distinct, that's sanctified, and taking that kind of sanctification or that boundary and learning from it and taking it into the city in a moment of political crisis.
I've seen some, thank you. I've seen some photos, of course, of your, what do we call it, intervention. Did you choose to, besides the photos, document this, and how did the cemetery play a role in that documentation, or did it not?
How did I decide to document it? Is
Correct.
that the basic question? Yeah. It was challenging, I think, because it was the first project that I had done that was that expansive, you know, where it was like at any moment the project was happening, or at every moment the project was happening. You know, it wasn't a performance for stage, or you know, it was time bound, but over a very long period, 6 months, right? And so I was trying to figure out how to document this kind of thing. And I mean, I just ended up working with a friend who was interested in what I was doing, and that was kind of like how it all happened. Just a friend was wanted to come with me one day to the cemetery, and she was one of the first. And her name is Nina Berfelde. She's also a walking artist, and she ended up becoming one. And she was a photographer too, and just started taking photos. And there's some problematics around, I think, taking photos within the cemetery. So the ones that I use for exhibitions or publications are more kind of distorted or difficult to see. They're not, they're more obscure than actually the ones in the streets where I have the Gaza shirt and everything. They're very clear, you know. So, but yeah, I mean, that's a brief way to respond to it. So
Thanks. Wonderful. Thanks. I'm going to move to Tom. Thanks, Tom, also for being here. You've written on ecological topics, particularly in Signal, if I'm not mistaken, and co-organized more recently the Edinburgh Walk for Gaza. How do you balance narrative-driven walking art with documenting political and ecological concerns, and how might, in your opinion, solo exploration differ from collective processions?
Thanks, Babak, and thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone. I'm really excited for this conversation to kind of develop over the course of the evening. It's a tricky, like, double pair of questions to start off with, but I'll just kind of introduce. Yeah, I've actually got the book sitting on my desk because I'm very organized. But yeah, the first 2017 book, Signal Failure, is that.
There you go.
It's showing back to front, and that was a solo walk along the, if anyone is aware of the HS2 train line. I did the walk in 2014 actually, so 10 years ago. and the train line is from London to Birmingham, and it's about 120 miles, and it's costing, I think, something like £100 billion. So it's something like £1 billion a mile. It's the most expensive railway ever built. And the walk was around thinking about landscapes and communities and places that would be lost via the building process, with the building of the railway. So it was kind of like imagining a future loss, I guess, and kind of seeing how that played out through the walk. And it was a kind of act of like getting to know, or getting a more detailed understanding of an area that I felt that I knew, and then kind of traversing into areas that I didn't know at all. It was a relatively straightforward solo walk, A to B in a line. So in terms of kind of narrative framing, it had a very simple. It's the first book I'd written. I was not very confident with complicated narratives, so it felt like an A to B line was a good way to start. Since then, I last year edited an anthology for the Whitechapel Gallery, part of Documents in Contemporary Art, on the subject of walking, which I also have here. And that, I think being an editor of an anthology rather than the writer of a book is obviously very different. And I feel like this kind of anthology rather than book as a collective kind of enterprise is really super rich and interesting. And also touches on this kind of question of documentation, I guess, because the works that we could include in the book were to some extent limited by what had been documented in some way, and therefore what was accessible to kind of navigate or engage with beyond the acts of those particular walks and art practices. Yeah, I can talk more about any of those things a bit later, but that's just a bit of an intro. I guess the premise of that anthology was that walking is political, so that sort of feels like it kind of chimes very well with yeah, the thinking behind this evening. And then in terms of the Gaza walks, yeah, we've organised 2 so far. One was in Scottish, or started in Berwick-upon-Tweed and kind of sort of, I guess, ghosted like back and forth along the Scotland-England border. That was in October last year. And then we did one in Edinburgh in May this year, and we also have another one in the works for October, starting in Newcastle, and I can talk a little bit more about that if people are interested. And those were basically the outline of Gaza transposed onto those different locations, so the borders and Edinburgh. And I guess the thinking was there's something very immediately obvious about taking one place and transposing it onto another. I think the obvious thing here is what a small area Gaza is, and obviously, as Babak has mentioned, like that's being sustained to over 2 years of bombing and now forced starvation as well. I think there's something about seeing how small that area is, and for people to know an area and recognize this kind of disjointedness between a map that the outline of which is familiar, but placed onto a series of place names that are familiar to them, they'll know. I think it's quite striking. And then obviously the other differences, well, there are many differences, but this that you asked about, from a solo walk to kind of forming a group collective walk around these. And I would say for me, being part of a community in terms of the organizing and the doing of the walks, it feels much richer and more connected and kind of, I guess, truer to a kind of ecological ethic that I think I'm more interested in than the kind of solo walking that I maybe was doing before. I'd also say purely like prosaically, these are also fundraising walks, and the more people involved, the wider that kind of network of potential donations spreads. So there's a kind of fairly like basic sense in which being part of a group is really productive. There's other things I can get into. I think what Nohad was saying about bringing literature into the walks is something that I'd love to chat about as well, because for the Gaza walks we also read a lot of mostly Palestinian poetry throughout, and I think that relationship between the text and the people and the place is really was something I hadn't expected, but was really rich.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think you're right also in mentioning Nohad in this with her mentioning of bringing in literature, because I think what that can do specifically in the way that Nohat was mentioning it, but also in the way that Robert was referring to it. Place can become a character through that, because you can see how historically places played different roles in exactly the same space, but with different functions, if you will, or with different roles. Thanks. Thank you. Now, I'm going to shift a little bit to more general questions, and I might throw them at someone in particular, but I might also ask anyone to be interested to pick up a question, to pick up the question. One that maybe ties into what a few of you have been saying. If you're walking in an act of or as a kind of solidarity, specifically across disparate geographies and struggles. You might be walking in Scotland, but being supportive of Palestine, for example. How do you avoid the risk? Is it a risk? And if it is a risk, how do you avoid the risk of it becoming a performative gesture or facilitating a kind of oversimplification of the problem that you are wanting to address? And if it is a risk, what principles or strategies do you have to ensure that the walks remain grounded in meaningful engagement? Anyone who wants to pick it up.
I guess I can speak to that. It sounded like it was directed at me a bit anyway.
Well, it wasn't, but I'm glad you pick it up.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just I mean, I guess to some extent there is an element of performance to this kind of thing, so I wouldn't necessarily think that that's intrinsically bad. But I think, I mean, as I mentioned, centering Palestinian voices and poetry all the way through felt really important. So that we were all walking with intention and focus and knowing why we were walking, and it not just being a nice walk. That was really important. I think so far they've been walks from Edinburgh, where I live, and also the borders where the other two people that I've worked with, artist Emily Cropton and curator Tiggy Muir, are based. So it felt very locally rooted. It wasn't kind of just pitching up somewhere that we didn't know and doing a thing. And similarly with the forthcoming Newcastle walk, that's working with an organisation there. So it feels like they're quite grounded in the places in which they happen. And yeah, as I say, they are fundraising walks for a particular family, the Matar family, and I will put the link in the chat in a bit, so that the money we raised goes to them and it keeps them alive, or it helps to keep them alive in a horrible situation. So I think there's there's something important there. Yeah.
So kind of maybe trying to stay grounded, if you will, is, if I may paraphrase it like this, a way to achieve this, or try to stay grounded. Related to this, perhaps, and that maybe is a bit more than directed towards Marta, because of although with the Global March to Gaza they were stopped at the start by Egyptian authorities. But maybe it also relates, Marta, to your journey through Europe with 2020 The Walk. When walking is an act of resistance, if you will, it can be deeply embodied. It's a very physical act. But how then, or it can be deeply embodied, but it can also be deeply emotional. And I think specifically Gaza would have been a very good example of this because of the urgency of the situation. People are literally dying, but also it applies, I think, to climate protests. Now, how were you participating in facilitating emotional care within the events, within the walks, whether for the participants or for communities, or for that you traveled through, and that might also relate a bit to Nohat's experience, or to yourself, and that might relate a little bit to Robert, focuses on deeply disturbing acts of the past, in ways maybe that sustain collective resilience and reflection. Maybe Marta, you want to take that first?
Yeah, thank you. That was one of the goals of this project, 2020 The Walk, because being a hardcore activist working, even if I'm an artist, I was not engaging in the art groups. I was in strategy, in action, and in outreach and communication. So with this project, which was a very long walk from Granada to Helsinki, it was not entirely on foot because it was produced after the pandemic. It was supposed to happen in 2020, but because of the pandemic, we had to postpone it for 2 years. So it finally happened in 2022. And then we had to do it in a very simple format. So finally, I didn't walk by myself. That was the original idea, to do it alone. But someone joined me, so he helped me with the production. But through these walks, which were somehow interrupted by some train journeys and a ferry to be able to reach Finland, we were connecting with other fellow activists, rebels from Extinction Rebellion and other movements to create a space, to reflect about things that in the daily life of activists, busy activists, we usually don't have the space to really discuss how we are feeling in regards extinction, in regards this 6 months extinction and all the ecosystems and life and communities which are disappearing. To process that grief, to create that space, that was one of the goals, and to be able not only to discuss about our inner feelings and emotions in regards to these eco-anxieties, but also to discuss about possible tactics and how to escalate in our actions. So there were different sides of the project, and through these community gatherings, we were also giving talks, and I was giving facilitating training in nonviolent direct action, because the goal was to invite the citizens to participate and actively engage in nonviolent civil disobedience and in real actions. So yeah.
You did this along your journey as you moved from Spain to Finland?
Exactly. We gave talks in all the countries and trainings and open discussions about the ecological, climate and civilization crisis we are in. So that was recorded in a film and also in a collective book. And yeah, so that was very moving to be able to connect with rebels from different countries, and some of us after we met in actual serious civil disobedience in Germany. So we are somehow creating a walking network, because we were doing these collective walks for a day or so. And yeah, it was very, very moving. So we it helped us to process also those feelings of grief and strong emotions, and accepting how bad is our predicament.
Yeah.
And what we can do about it. Yes.
So in a way, you yourself facilitated emotional care in your walk to Finland by interacting with the communities you walked through. And
I was giving as well, so yeah, both ways. Yes.
Can you speak to whether there was policy is maybe not the right word, but whether there was something similar provided for with the Global March to Gaza, or you maybe are not aware? I don't know.
I was just a participant in the Global March to Gaza, and since there were massive deportations in Egypt, and some of us we could not meet physically because, well, you can follow the official statements about what happened there. But we finally could gather some people in the checkpoint 1, some people in the checkpoint 2. But it was not after when we met in Tunis. Some of us moved to Tunis because it was part of a broader coalition with the Sumud convoy from Maghreb and the Freedom Flotilla. So in Tunis, we could finally gather and meet each other and to develop a common strategy and have these personal talks and debriefings about how we were feeling about these horrible times with genocide. And yeah, it was very, very useful to have the chance to discuss and meet physically in Tunis.
With like-minded spirits, I understand. Noah or Robert, do you want to add to this? Because your contexts are a bit different.
Noah, do you want to? You're welcome to go first. I might address the first question, if that's okay, that you asked, that Tom responded to. So I think like one thing, I guess the way that I would just to rehash it, I think the question was around how do you ground the political walk in local circumstances, in local places. And so I would say that this has become very central to what I do. And actually in that first project that I mentioned, Lost in Jüdische Friedhof Eisensee, I would say that was even less so the case than following projects. And mostly I would say because that was a solo work, and that I feel like I was working more with the way that the city kind of collectively or through architecture communicated, and then I was trying to communicate back with it or using the city's language of memory in order to say something else that I felt like needed to be said, both about the past and about the present. But since then, actually, like the way that I've created walking-based works in Poland and then here where I live on the traditional territories of the Lami and Nooksack nations in the Pacific Northwest, and then more recently in the Kurdish diaspora in Canada. The way that a work is developed in terms of, I'm still working with memory, but that the memory of a place creates a walk through working directly with people. So it's through kind of collective imagining or working with people over months and actually years to kind of dredge up memories and ideas or even inherited or remembered acts that then are kind of reenacted or developed, for the circumstances of the present. And so in that way, I guess an example is like in this new project with the Kurdish thinker Nastaran Saremi, we're developing a walk called Oaks Night in Toronto with the Canadian Kurdish Community Center. And this walk is based on her grandmother or her dada's a kind of act that she developed that fused two traditional ceremonies, a grieving ceremony and a ceremony that's calling for rain, called the Buka Barana, where she took a grieving structure called an alam and she merged it with the Buka Barana puppet, which is part of a ceremony that children would carry these dolls around praying for rain. And the idea is that rain is something that's given to the poor, that keeps basically the poor nourished. And so it's this kind of act of earthly liberation that the earth is always responsible for to counteract the man-made acts of violence and oppression. And so this, through many years of conversations and thinking together, and then eventually with a larger community of people in the Kurdish diaspora in Toronto, we create a kind of structure that's taking place. So it's coming out of people's imaginations, out of their minds, out of their family histories. And I think increasingly that's the kind of practice that I'm interested in facilitating. So.
Thank you. So this is extensive collaboration, discussion, and cooperation, what you are describing. I might come back later to the piece that you briefly mentioned, which was set on I cannot pronounce this, but the Native American grounds that where you talk about displacement.
Sure.
A fascinating piece as well. Noah, do you want to add a little bit to this, perhaps?
Yeah, maybe. I guess talking from my positionality, which is, let's say, working in Beirut, or if I traveled somewhere abroad, I was part of a residency in Frankfurt. So this like Lebanese woman working in Frankfurt. And I think for me, one of the main worries also almost was that to which audience I'm talking to, let's say, or to whom I'm talking, and whether there is this idea of falling into stereotypes, but also answering to which questions. And for me, that's very important in a sense that sometimes we get lost even in Beirut to, I know, the grants or to whom we want to share those works. And it becomes then performative because I'm kind of answering something that the other is already imposing in me, and I'm playing on these impositions and those already concepts and contextualizations that are already there. But it can also be contexts that are already doesn't need to be foreign. It can be religious, it can be cultural, it can be political. So how to really like kind of, take yourself in a way, and it's very difficult, I guess, from that performativity. And walking truly is to answer, for me, it was to answer my own questions and to understand my own city in a better way. And it's interesting because when I started to walk, I wasn't reading literature about walking. So I walked first, and then I realized, there is literature about walking, which actually was fascinating. But when I was walking, some of my walking experiences were anger, were frustration, were a lot of these like very confrontational experiences, which was really different than the literature also, and who's talking about walking in the literature, let's say. So I guess this is how I managed to try to navigate this kind of tension somehow, and to remind myself is to go back again and again to my intention and to my intuition in a way, and following that. And I remember also another project, I wanted to do a collective walk, and it was in a gallery context that I needed to show the project later. And the collective walk didn't materialize because I wanted to do an emerging process, and the way how the institution worked is that it needed a more like definite process, like what is the product? And I was like, I don't know what is the product. It needs to emerge. So what happened then is I walked alone. So it's also, I guess, navigating all of these tensions that already are at institutional levels, if we want to work with institutions, but also at those systems that are already present and we are already operating within. And maybe the first step is just being aware of them. What is the language that we are using? And which language is this? Is it my language coming from my own culture? I defined it, or is it a language that I inherited somehow? Yeah.
Do you find, Nohad, that you mentioned one way you achieve this is by going back to your intention, but going back to your intuition. Do you find this for you, is this easier when you do this in like Lebanon, where you're much more familiar with the place? Or do you find this is easier when you're like on a residency where you're more distant and maybe can take a more step, can take a step back and can take an approach that distances yourself from the place? Where do you find this is easier to do?
I think it's equally difficult in a way, because again, in Frankfurt or in somewhere in the West, I am a Middle Eastern woman, and I need, and this is something that is already there. And if I want to talk to it, also, I don't want to fall into, again, a certain kind of comparison. Like for me, Frankfurt was very structured. And it was easily to say, oh, this is structured, but Beirut is chaotic. But did I want to do this? I didn't. So eventually I started to talk about Frankfurt and what I'm seeing on Frankfurt. While here also, there is other ways that also governs you. So it's not really easy or hard. It's just like what is actively at play. And also this is something that is very in the moment. So I can walk today in Beirut, Lebanon, under certain conditions, but also tomorrow it will be a very different day, a very different energy, a very different dynamics at play based on what is happening. But also something else that helps, again, is literature. Literature always grounds me somehow.
All right, thanks. Also a question for anyone who wants to pick it up. You are a fairly broad collection of. I'm not going to try to group you. I'm going to just say something like artists, walkers, activists, writers, researchers. I was trying to avoid the use of the word content creators, which you are not. What interdisciplinary collaborations have shaped your practice in relation to specifically walking? Or maybe you can bring up an example or two of where your walking practice was strongly influenced by someone that you collaborated with, which was not at all connected, whose practice was not at all connected to walking. And how has this influenced your work and maybe the outcomes of your work? Interdisciplinary collaborations.
I could respond to this. So yeah, maybe I would talk about the project that you mentioned wanting to ask about. So Flight Manifesto was a walk in 3 parts up the Nooksack River, which is the river in the territory that I live. So it's like the heart of the watershed between the mountains and the sea. And this was a work with a large group of people, I think maybe up to 20 or something. And part of that group was a deaf social service organization called Cascadia Deaf Nation. And so there were people from that group that does basically advocacy, education, and direct service to deaf people of color throughout the US. And we started working together because I was friends with the founder. So in some ways, like in this case, I was bringing a walking act into a space like Cascadia Deaf Nation that didn't necessarily, like, that wasn't part of what they did. And so we were kind of working together in the act of walking as a kind of new practice or something. And I think what's interesting, so I guess in one way, one of the obvious concerns of working together was linguistic justice. And the project was very much concerned with confronting the architectures, the foundational architectures of settler colonization in the territory. So kind of like where it actually began, it began in logging. It began at this military site, which no longer exists. So actually walking through these places and learning about them over time. the project was a collaboration also with the Palestinian sound artist Durar Kalash, who is working with us from afar. And so we were doing, and Durar is also hard of hearing. So the project became a lot about not hearing and what does listening mean in excess of the physical act of hearing. And then also the practical and kind of justice oriented questions of how do we work together between hearing and deaf people in order to confront this ongoing legacy of colonial violence between Palestine and North America. And so there were all of these kind of acts and considerations and politics that have, you know, on the surface, nothing to do with walking. And I'll just end by saying, like, one of the things that people sometimes bring up when they ask about this work is like, why is it called Flight Manifesto? You know, when you're walking, you're like on the ground, you know? And I feel like there was something about, there's something about actually the tension of bringing things that have nothing to do with walking, or that even are like impossible to walking, like flight, you know, to the act itself, that draws out kind of the way in which when we're walking, there's kind of this kind of, I don't know, these kind of internal potentialities or transpersonal potentialities that kind of arise that don't actually manifest physically, but happen in a, I guess, in a kind of spiritual sense. When we walk together, when we walk with intention, when we create a kind of narrative between locations, or when we do something like follow or learn from a river, you know, with our bodies, and put ourselves in another kind of condition that we're not used to, which is like where we're signing and no one is talking with their voices, you know, we're like, and forming a kind of walk-in commons, you could say, in relation to someone who's not even there, who can't be there because he's in an occupied territory, you know. So I guess that's kind of that would be a way of talking about it, the way that not walking pressures and forms and kind of nourishes the imaginary potentialities and spiritual realities of walking.
If I may paraphrase, Robert, I think what you're kind of, or maybe kind of covers what you're saying is that the collaboration broadens and deepens the experience that you are creating. Thanks. Does this also mean for you, and maybe also for others, but to Robert specifically because you responded, do you seek out these collaborations, these cross-disciplinary collaborations more now, based on your experience? You are muted.
Sorry, was that a question to me?
Well, yeah, yeah. Do you seek
okay.
out collaborations more as a consequence of your experience in these collaborations?
Yeah, that's a critical. Yeah. Pretty much everything I do is with other people now. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else wants to speak to collaborations and how they influence the outcome of your work?
I can sort of follow on from what Robert was saying, potentially. It's maybe less about interdisciplinary collaboration and maybe more around influence in general, but just in terms of Robert's incredibly beautiful answer, actually, but just in terms of what you were saying about that relationship between flight and walking, it just reminded me of a project by another artist that was really influential, I think, for me in terms of kind of everything I've thought about since, but particularly around these Gaza walks. And that was a project called Bordered Miles by an artist called Iman Tajik, and it was it was a 26-mile day walk for a group, and I think from the centre of Glasgow south to Dungavel Immigration Removal Centre, and it was a group. He led it in 2020 as part of a festival called Glasgow International, and then again in 2023 with an institution called the Hunterian in Glasgow. And yeah, it was a very like clear way of connecting the center of a city with a kind of hidden infrastructure of bordering and detention, which is run by the UK government. It's not run by the Scottish government, but there are facilities like that in Scotland. So there's this very interesting like connection made from the city to this location, Dungavel, and particularly thinking around, yeah, there was a moment where Iman did a kind of quite light touch performance, but it was basically placing these different colored tapes across the road and then tying similar tapes around each of our legs. We had a bit of kind of reading, and then there was this kind of sense that a border had been placed in the landscape, I guess. But what I guess was kind of interesting was that firstly, like cars would just drive across it. So it was it was a border for us, but it was very fragile and it had just been kind of constructed and we would take it away again shortly afterwards. So I think there's something quite beautiful about that recognition. Well, there was something quite horrible about the fact that the border is kind of everywhere and it isn't a place, it's a technology. But also that it could be removed. Like if it has a beginning, it can also has an end. It's constructible and therefore deconstructible, I guess, which I thought was really powerful. And just in terms of that question of flight, while we were reading and standing there, there was like swallows going back and forth overhead. And it reminded me that on the front cover of Harsha Wallier's book, Border and Rule, which I've been reading kind of around doing that walk, there are swallows on there. And that sense of them obviously being very symbolic of movement across borders felt very powerful, I guess. And then there was something just that Iman did for the last hour of the walk, just got everyone, like shortly after this kind of performance, got everyone to walk in silence to the removal center. And I think it was super simple, but it just got everyone to focus very directly on what we were doing and why we were doing it. And I think this sense of like, yeah, a community that had kind of formed for this walk, like a temporary community, but having this kind of clarity of purpose. Yeah, it was super powerful. It just, I don't know if this particularly answers your question, but like it kind of came to mind while Robert was speaking.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the kind of cross-disciplinary, a consequence of cross-disciplinary collaboration. I'm also reminded with the piece that you were describing of drawing the borders of Francis Alice's The Green Line, so coincidentally set in Israel or Palestine. Thanks. Another question, and this also for all of you. Now, in one way or the other, obviously, you're addressing society's problems, societal ills. So arguably, that's where you draw inspiration from. But the format that you choose to address these could be many things. Now, so this is a composite question. So why choose walking or marching? Where do you draw your inspiration from to do the work that you're doing in the way that you're doing it? And do you try to inspire others with the work, not with the political objective, but with how you choose to perform the work that you are doing? And then if that's not enough, the immediate follow-up question is, what keeps you motivated? So, who wants to go first? Where do you draw? Marta, go for it.
Okay, are many questions. Can you rephrase them, please?
I'll do it in short. Where do you draw your inspiration from? And I don't mean the political injustice. I mean the inspiration to do the work the way that you're doing. Do you try to inspire others with the work, with the way that you work? And what keeps you motivated?
Vale. Well, I must say that before doing walking art pieces, I've been a walker all my life before. I don't even have a driving license, so I'm used to long distance walks, like a daily life. And my inspiration, I don't think it comes from the realm of the art world, but mostly from long marches, political marches, and mostly spiritual pilgrimage along all the world, different traditions. And before I thought to put this walking, which was, as I said, a part of my daily life practice, into a project of art. I feel inspired by the flow, how walking allows you to, as Robert was saying, to explore more, being present here now in the world, and being part while you walk. You realize, you feel that you are connected and that you are part of interconnectedness of life, no? How we are part of a wave of life beyond the self. So that's where I draw my inspiration, also from different marches. I've participated in my political engagement before. And how to inspire others? Well, I think that by creating different ways of life, other scenarios beyond the capitalist societies, putting that in practice is by itself inspiring. How to articulate solidarity with others beyond the art. I mean, what I've been told is that I'm more inspiring when I'm putting my art into practice for the service of an activist struggle. So some artists see me as a reference in the way that I'm abandoning art. I reject my own production. I reject art, because artists, we are very much needed into activism. I think at this point of history, we are in a threshold, and we need to put our talents and skills to the service of the social transformation. So, and what motivates me going? I think we have no choice. I think we really need to be of service. And I see the long struggles of many worlds and communities along the world, that we are fighting something that is beyond us, is more important than our personal aspirations or our personal lives. And we are really fighting for something bigger than ourselves. So I keep motivated, thinking that my life can be of service. Basically, that's it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Marta. Who else wants to comment on this?
I think I can go. Just again, also going back to when I first started the walking practice, which was part of the master's, but it wasn't the medium that I thought I would choose anyway. I didn't know it existed as a medium of research. And I think for me, I always go back to that moment, which was a very dire, and I can still feel it in my body, a need to walk. I really needed to be in the city. And that was right after the Beirut port explosion. So already the city had another, let's say, explosion, literally, already over so many layers of explosions. So, and I needed really, I think, to exist in the city, or else I would have maybe immigrated, to walk, to understand it in a different way, where I'm physically in it, where I'm physically moving in it somehow, and I'm physically kind of in this direct and can be very raw contact with it somehow. And I guess along the years also, after Gaza's war, but then also with the war on Lebanon last year, I was also in Beirut and I stayed. And I was able to walk because I was also privileged that I was in an area that was considered safe, so I can walk within the premises of that area. But because also living in, let's say, in times of violence, but always under warfare somehow, the first intuition, or what I've lived also since childhood, was to stay at home. This is the first reaction, is to stay indoors. So walking is in itself where okay, I need to be outside actually, in a way that, to work with my questions in a way. So when I started also, I always, I had one question, but as I said, I came back with 10. It was always more questions and more, and now actually for me, it's more definitions and definitions. context, of concepts, of ideas. So I don't know if it's a motivation or it's just like literally a need to survive, to just do it, you know, and then trying to, yeah, make projects around the way I can genuinely, let's say, mirror that practice or those ideas. And in terms of inspiration, I think for me it wasn't in the walking realm, it was more in the facilitation realm. Because for me, facilitation, what I've seen from really amazing facilitators that I've been working with and trained with, was this idea of opening and holding a space for others. And what Marta said at the beginning about, you know, this emotional care is about just being together. And I do believe that all of this violence, whether we are in Lebanon or somewhere else, is about disconnecting. Although you can feel disconnection, you know, it's like not every walk is about connection. Sometimes it's about disconnection. But violence, and this perpetual violence, this very strategic and structured violence, is about disconnection from also yourself. So that is the inspiration, I think, for me, is to just keep on that connection somehow with myself, with what I like, even with the others, and the others with me. So that kind of movement, in a way, you know, to weave it again, because in those times, yeah, they are, you know, they are kind of poof, you know, like just disappearing somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think about inspiring others. I don't know. I feel like, yeah, I feel like for me, it's a very strong responsibility. So I just do what I want to do or what I feel I need to do. And then if others want to pick up on it, it's good. Yeah, but I guess it's also this is always, I have this tension with that idea somehow. I don't know why. But this is how I've been doing it, I guess.
Thanks. I'm glad that you bring up this drive for facilitating connection, because I think this also very much ties into what Marta and I earlier talked about, but also the conflict, what the conflict in the Middle East is a driver for, which is global capitalism, which atomizes society. It disconnects us from the people around us and tries to establish connections between the individual and the purveyors of big capital, perhaps through the devices that we have in our hands. And facilitating these connections between people allows for, well, not only stronger bonds, but also a way to collectively, also facilitates a way to collectively push back against the abuse that we have, that we suffer as individuals through the ways in which the elites manipulate. It's very general, but manipulate us as individuals. Thanks.
I just want to say, sorry, just one thing, not only people, but also, you know, the non-human as well, like with the city, with the cats in the city, you know, with the dogs in the city, with the buildings. So it's really a disconnection from everything, anyway, even from food. So yeah, not only people.
No, you're very right. Thanks. Robert or Tom, do you want to say something about where you draw your inspiration from with your work, or whether you try to inspire others with your work, and what keeps you motivated?
This is a hard question these days. I think I'll just try to answer it simply. It's also hard to follow Nohad and Marta, who spoke so profoundly. I think that I've been like very influenced by certain mentors in my life, so I think it's easy for me to say to talk about them or just to name them. But my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, has been very influential in kind of both indirect and direct ways. And some of my kind of most valued memories as a child are walking with him in the forest, and just kind of his presence. Like he just had a very calm and thoughtful presence, and the way that he spoke to others, showed me that, and the way that he spoke to me showed me that. And actually he's still alive actually, and he's pretty much lost his memory. So it's kind of a time when I'm really thinking about him a lot, and I'd like to do a work in the town that he lived in for most of his life. But actually my whole relationship to memory and working with memory started with his family ran a store, and he ended up running it until he was 80, and he was born in it and lived above it, and when I was growing up, the apartment that they had lived in was abandoned, and then he was running the store underneath, and my brother and I would kind of explore and stuff. And when I got older, in my early 20s, I started going there because I was interested in the politics and the culture of traditional Judaism, and that family was the last was the only kind of example of traditional Judaism in living memory in my family. And so I realized that actually this apartment was basically this kind of archive, or this story of this way that my family had lived before they became white Americans. And so it became this. I basically developed what I call the practice of durational contemplation through going to work with him, and then I would just go upstairs. And kind of like, and then of course the building left the family, and so it's all of that is gone. And I have this kind of apartment like in my mind now because I spent this time with it. And I think that developed a kind of way to actually work with others or help others kind of do something like that within the emergencies or within the locations that they live. And so just to finish, kind of, I guess the things that inspire me are these sort of intense relationships, like my collaborator Nastaran and her relationship to her late Dada is so intense and so politicizing. And it's like these kinds of relationships are just like I learn everything from them, So they seem to be the only things that survive periods of real kind of darkness, I think. But
interesting. You also very much with that to tie it to place, and maybe are you also saying that your personal experience with the house above the shop that you mentioned has been a driver for also very much situating your work in connection to physical spaces?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's where place and time and relationships and culture, that these things come together in. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Yeah. So you all now, Robert, you're mentioning it explicitly, and Noah had also brought it up a bit earlier, and Marta a little bit too. But my next question, sort of like has been already a bit addressed by all of you, but maybe you want to speak a little bit more to it, which is why did you end up choosing walking as at least a part of your artistic expression, and why perhaps utilize it as a political act? Who wants to jump in? Marta.
Well, in my case, I think I explained a little bit, but being a full hardcore activist, I was feeling that I really needed to reconnect with nature in a very physical way. And walking is also part of what made us humans, and reconnecting with other ways of living, more slow and in a different pace, and exploring the territories and the ecosystems, intimately living outdoors day by day, like this lasted 7 months, and we were walking 5 months total. So it was really a very transformative experience. So I missed that after the walk, and I said I have to do another project, but this time more intimate by myself. So I was living during the, I have to put this in context, during the very extreme drought which we live in Spain last year, especially in Catalonia. So I was living alone in the middle of nowhere with a caravan, no car, because I don't drive, just the caravan. And I was fetching water every day, going by walk towards the most beautiful fountain ever. So that was my daily life practice, and going on foot to fetch this water, which is a daily life activity in so many places in the world, but it's also part of our past, and maybe it's prefiguring what is going to come in a post-oil world, in a collapse world, or well, it's the current reality of so many millions of people these days as well, so we cannot forget that. But I needed that intimate, somehow spiritual experience of living in that way. But it's not explicit in the work you see in the video I recorded. It's not explicit, but while I was living that experience with this context of the drought, and really like we were listening the authorities saying that maybe we need to take boats with water to Barcelona city because maybe there's not going to be water. So in that context, I was also reflecting about my role as an activist, my role as an artist, which is going to be part also of my PhD. So that was a very meditative period. And I think I really need to, after hardcore activism, I need to reconnect through art or through life experience, creating new contexts and new existential scenarios. Yeah, to find somehow the balance. Yeah.
Thanks. Anyone else who wants to comment on how you started with walking as a form of expression? Or not? I indeed. Someone jumps in. Tom, maybe go for it, Tom, if you want.
I was gonna go back to the motivation question actually, if that's all right.
It is.
It was just to kind of pick up a little bit on what Nahad was saying around connection, and I feel like similarly for me that was a really important part of, yeah, particularly the Gaza walks that we've been organising, and I think, yeah, I guess over the last couple of years I've been much more involved in various kind of organising collectives, particularly Fossil Free Books in the UK, who have done a lot of organising around, yeah, sponsorship of literary festivals and encouraging, like, basically trying to see a publishing industry free from investment in fossil fuel extraction and Israeli apartheid. And being part of that kind of collective has felt really powerful. And I think one of the things that was interesting about organising these walks, particularly the first one, is people saying, because it was in a relatively rural area, people talking about being in urban spaces, there was quite a lot of activism and quite easy to kind of plug into organising collectives that were active, whereas in some rural spaces maybe that was harder. And I think people who took part in the walk were really, I guess, appreciative that there was like a way to be involved and be active and be part of a community, even if it was quite temporary. And I think it felt important that those walks could, to what extent they have, I'm not sure, but they could potentially open a space for like a longer term communities to form and connections to form that could lead to kind of other ways of people working together, organizing together. Yeah, so I think that kind of connection on a kind of personal level, like working with artists and curators and other writers who really I find inspiring, but also like that kind of broader creation of and like connecting with wider communities and collectives felt really significant. Yeah, sorry, that was back on the motivation question.
Yeah, it also ties into another question that I had lined up, although to tell you all that I think slowly time to start wrapping up. We're reaching the 90-minute mark. But the one question that I also had lined up was indeed about collaboration and how you facilitate or foster collaboration with other artists or other disciplines. And whether perhaps for people in the audience, you have suggestions as to how to make that work. It's generally, at least in my experience, difficult to get others to get on board with something that you want to do, but you're more likely to be successful. So, how in your experience, do you get these collaborations off the ground, or what have you found works for you?
I can jump in. And I guess also tying it to my experience with facilitating workshops, mainly, which I'm also bringing walking slowly into it as well. I guess it's, for me, it's all really related to the invitation, to what kind of invitation and what kind of space you are opening for that invitation in a way, and where this invitation is rooted somehow. So usually most of my workshops are publicly announced, and then people register and like they are selected and all of that. But also the people I work with, it's usually by this intention and this invitation that is, okay, I'm also doing this because I have those questions. And that really kind of sets the tone of not really, I want to do this, like it's very rigid and we have to do this. It's more of, this is the framework and we are all kind of holding it together as well. And we are working with it to see what will come out of it. That starting from there, and that invitation for always in my practice felt also in a way genuine, but also allowed those connections to be genuine as well and to be organic somehow. So it flows. And taking people along, I always end up with saying that it's a privilege, but also I don't take it for granted, because indeed it's very hard, to trust someone telling you, okay, let's go for a walk, holding a book or whatever, and then you'll have to follow that. So I guess also recognizing the effort of the others, the emotional labor or also the intellectual labor that's already there in the dynamic. I guess, yeah, those were like, this was a bit my experience somehow.
Thanks. Okay, I'm gonna somewhat finish with my questions. I've got one more, but in the meantime, I want to give the audience a few chances to also jump in, which I should have done earlier, but I didn't. Let that be a lesson for me. Somewhere there's a question. Who has question for the speakers? There's a few that were asked here and there. There was one on YouTube, which was specific. Oh, who was that? No one. One on YouTube specifically around whether Tom can post some of the references that Tom, that you mentioned earlier on. Maybe put the links. You might put the links in the chat, but that's not going to go to YouTube. So maybe you can put the links in the chat, and I collect any links that people put in chat, and then I'll put it on the website. And then tomorrow you can look it up on the website. Maybe that's a good idea. Applies to everyone else too. Another question that was for Robert, specifically with your the piece that you early on mentioned with Gaza in 3 languages on your back. whether that led to any conflict, maybe verbal or physical, or with an altercation perhaps with city authorities.
Yeah, I thought we wouldn't have time, so I tried to answer the question briefly in the chat, but I can be a bit more detailed. I mean, I would say that what's telling about that work. So at that time, I think the politics around one relating the Holocaust to the conditions and the histories of Palestine, Israel was completely faux pas, you know, and no one would touch it. I mean, very, very few people. There was a kind of landmark book called The Holocaust and the Nakba, which is a really important text that came out. But especially in Berlin, it really wasn't something that people, even who were engaged in the struggles, very few people would want to touch. So I think, and then in terms of just like Gaza or what was happening in Gaza at that moment, similarly, it was just something that would be ignored, you know, by the public-facing German society. And so I think it would be really different if I were to do these walks now. I might even face arrest or something. But I think that at that time, people pretty much just ignored me.
When was this?
This was in 2018.
Okay.
So there was I mean, pretty much people ignored me. There was one of the walks, I went from the Israeli embassy to Jüdische Friedhof Weissensee and passing through the largely Palestinian district on Sonnenallee in Neukölln. And at the embassy, there was like a police van that followed me a couple blocks. And then I wrote this in the chat, but interestingly, like the most attention that I received was on Sonnenallee, like walking through the cafes, and you know, which were mostly Arabic people, and a lot of refugees from Lebanon and Palestine, and people were staring at me, and usually it was like maybe being a bit confused, but I also had a text that I was handing out that was in German, Arabic, and English, and so it stated what I was doing very clearly. It said, "This Jewish body walks in solidarity with the Palestinian right of return. His ancestors are from the eradicated Jewish communities of," and then it listed all of the cities and villages that my family had lived.
Were you doing this walk on your own, or did you have
there were a couple people with me who were like, there was a photographer, but she was kind of keeping a distance. She had a special lens so that she could be far away. And then there was someone who was passing out these texts when people showed interest. But what's interesting is that in Sonnenallee, one thing that I noticed was that when I would often hear people kind of saying Gaza to themselves as they saw my back, you know. And so there was this kind of feeling that just naming Gaza was like, even though the act itself, you know, you would have to read it visually and kind of think about it, but it's just saying the name, you know. And so it's an ambivalent act, you know. It's not a direct, if you don't read the text, it's ambivalent, which I wanted it to be, you know. But that in that place, that it meant something to people. It almost felt ceremonious, like hearing people say Gaza as I walked by, that it was important to name it, you know, to say it out loud. Yeah. So
thanks. Any questions from the audience here on Teams? Put up your hand, virtual, otherwise I might not see you. If not, then my last, you're welcome to jump in. Don't feel like you're being excluded. Maybe I should wait 10 seconds. No. My last question is an open question. What has been left unsaid? What should I have asked? Or what is it, maybe the four of you, that you want to bring up that I should have asked? Marta.
Well, given this horrible situation context, I think we need to put all the production on hold, stop all our lives, stop our aspirations, our dreams, and put all the energy and our bodies in the marches for the stopping the genocide and until the total liberation of Palestine. There's nothing more important because Gaza is the future of all of us. And I think there's nothing more important, and we should really focus on organizing and putting our bodies on the place of harm. That means stopping where the weapons are produced, stopping the boats that transport those, participating in marches. There are so many different levels where you can participate, but there's nothing ever more important than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. I think you're very correct. I think Gaza is the laboratory where what they find works to suppress. You and I will suffer tomorrow, next week, next month, or next year. Absolutely. That's indeed why, for me, this is the most important conflict of our times. Thanks. Nohat, Tom, Robert, anything I forgot that you would like to say? In that case, there's a late question for YouTube, slightly less weighted, and that's the following. Do any of you consider your art as a walking tour, or is this term too loaded as entertainment?
I don't, but I know some people who do really great work with walking tours. There's someone, actually, my project Flight Manifesto is really influenced by a historian named Josh Soretti, who teaches with me here at Western Washington University, and created a public project called Bellingham from Below. It's also been called Colonizing and Decolonizing Bellingham, a walking tour. And I learned, and a lot of people learn a lot from that tour about the real history of this small city that we live in. And I think that like walking tours and other similar kind of practices of historical critique, or even just like ongoing providing other narratives, I think it's a really like cheap way. Like if museums like show us like a really expensive and monuments show us a really expensive and red taped way to create public narratives, walking tours are a really cheap and accessible way and really effective to tell other stories and to raise public consciousness in place. And I think that the telling of story in place does something to one's body and mind that just really links things almost in a kind of permanent way. So, I mean, as a teacher, I think doing things that bring the body and the intellect together in single gestures is like the most effective kind of pedagogical instrument humans have. And it's a way that we remember things. It's a way that we care about things. It's a way that we become involved in things, you know. So I think walking tours can be really, really incredible, you know, and have learned a lot from them myself. So.
Yeah, I echo what you're saying, Robert. For me, also place-based storytelling in situ, and I find very satisfying to create, but also to consume. And you can convey pure entertainment with it, but you can also do historical storytelling, convey much more harsher truths. Thanks. Nohat or Tom or well, Marta already had a word there.
I guess I will echo Robert exactly. I've been also I know personally, and some Lebanese artists that have been using walking in a way to also, I guess, bring that to bring back the history, the contested history, and working with it and reimagine it also in a way, and you know, kind of bringing indeed all of these notions in one walking tour. And also just walking tours that are more of an introduction, or to let people know the history of the spaces in Beirut, because it's already loaded somehow. But indeed, I guess in my practice, I haven't been experimenting with it, and I feel like, yeah, it's something that I'm not called for, I guess, at least for now, in a way. So, yeah.
Thanks. Tom, do you want to add something?
Sure, yeah, I think I'd answer similarly, which is that I don't see what we've done as walking tours, although there have been elements of like kind of historic local knowledge that kind of feed in and kind of enrich the walks, I think. But yeah, I'd also add that there's loads of artists doing work with walking tours that's super interesting, and particularly, yeah, around like maybe making visible or like uncovering erased or contested histories. In the walking anthology, there's a project in Chicago by Ji and Lee that is super interesting, and there's also a project in South Africa, like looking at kind of apartheid forced removals in various districts. So I think walking tours can be like a super rich medium, particularly for kind of uncovering certain histories and like mapping, or like seeing how maps have altered all these kind of multiple layers that coexist.
Yeah, I totally I echo what you're all saying. I actually started myself with location-based storytelling around the June 76 uprisings in Soweto, where we used this was in 2004, so around that time, where we used Google Maps to do location-based storytelling a long time ago. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to wrap up. Thanks to the speakers, Nohat and Tom and Robert and Marta. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for the audience who was here in Teams and there on YouTube. I'll add a bunch of links to the article, to the post on the Walkless Create website, and the video, the recording will be available probably immediately because it's broadcast. As I mentioned at the start, this was part of a collaboration between myself of Walkless Create and Mary of Action Synergy. We're part of a collaboration called Walking Arts and Local Communities. We are going to have a bunch more events over the next 2.5 years, online and offline. So I hope to welcome back many of you, online or offline. And with that, I will again thank Robert, Tom, Nohat, and Marta, and I hope to see you online or offline soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Free Palestine.